Hey guys, tonight I need to tell you about 68 minutes, not an hour, not 90 minutes, 68. That is exactly how long it took 12 men sitting in a courtroom in New Bedford, Massachusetts on June 20th, 1893, to decide that Lizzie Borden did not kill her father and stepmother with a hatchet on a sweltering August morning. 68 minutes. You could boil a pot of water and fold your laundry in 68 minutes. You could watch half a movie. You could take a slow walk around the block and be back home before the verdict came in. But these 12 men, all of them male as required by law in 1892 Massachusetts, had just sat through 14 days of testimony. They had heard witnesses. They had seen photographs of a sitting room that looked like something out of a nightmare. They had listened to lawyers describe what a hatchet does to a human skull at close range. And then they went out, and 68 minutes later, they came back, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. People cheered. Women in the gallery wept. Newspapers called it a victory for justice. Lizzie Borden stood in that courtroom, 32 years old, and listened to the verdict that set her free. Now, here is what I need you to hold on to before we go any further. Those 12 men deliberated for 68 minutes on a case that rested on 3 pieces of evidence that they never actually heard. The jury that acquitted Lizzie Borden did not hear that she had tried to purchase a lethal poison one day before the murders. They did not hear her contradictory testimony about where she was during the 90-minute window when her stepmother was being killed inside the same house. And they did not hear, they could not examine the dress she burned in the kitchen stove 3 days after her parents were found dead. This is not a video about whether Lizzie Borden was guilty. I want to be very clear about that right now, because what I am about to tell you is more disturbing than a verdict. This is a video about what a courtroom decided to remove before the jury walked in, and what those removals, stacked one on top of the other, tell us about how justice worked in 1892 for a woman with money, a prominent family name, and a defense attorney who used to be the governor of Massachusetts. You know the rhyme. Everyone does. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. The rhyme, by the way, is not even accurate on the numbers, but we'll get to that. What you probably do not know is the architecture of what was sealed, excluded, and quietly burned before that jury ever heard a single word. There are 3 doors in this case, 3 pieces of the story that were locked before the jury walked in. Tonight, we are going to open all 3. But first, and I mean this, we need to go back to August 4, 1892. Not to the sitting room, not to the body on the sofa. We need to go to the Gap. Because everything in this case, every argument, every theory, every piece of evidence, every legal maneuver lives inside a single 90-minute window. Between approximately 9 in the morning and 10:30, Abby Borden was killed in the upstairs guest bedroom of the house at 92 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. She was struck 19 times with a sharp-edged instrument. Medical examiners determined she died in that upstairs room. Roughly 90 minutes later, Andrew Borden, her husband, Lizzie's father, came home from his morning errands downtown, settled onto the sitting room sofa, and was also killed. Between 10 and 11 blows. Also by a sharp-edged instrument. Lizzie Borden was in the house for both. She could not explain, consistently, where she was during those 90 minutes. The jury never heard that. Sit with that for a moment. The woman on trial could not provide a consistent account of her movements during the exact window when 2 people were killed inside her home. And the 3 judges presiding over the most sensational murder trial in New England history ruled that the jury did not need to know. I am not editorializing. I am reading from the trial record. So, tonight we are going to walk through this case the way a jury should have been allowed to. We are going to talk about what happened on August 3rd, the day before the murders, when Lizzie walked into a drugstore on Main Street and asked for something that a clerk named Eli Bentz refused to sell her without a prescription. We are going to talk about what she said at the inquest, under oath, before she had a lawyer in the room, and how that testimony shifted and changed across 3 days of questioning. We are going to talk about the dress, and we are going to talk about the courtroom itself, about who the judge was, who appointed him, and what he told the jury right before they walked out to deliberate. And at the end of all of it, I am going to let you sit with a single question. If the jury had heard everything, not just what the judges allowed, but all of it, would 68 minutes have been enough? If this kind of story is what you came here for, the version where the real history is stranger and quieter than what the textbooks kept, then subscribe. So the next time we sit down with a ledger like this one, you are already here. Because what comes next is the part of this story that almost nobody talks about. And it starts the day before anyone died. Before you can understand what happened inside 92 2nd Street, you have to understand what kind of house it was. Not just the address, not just the square footage, what it felt like to live there. Andrew Jackson Borden was, by 1892, one of the wealthiest men in Fall River, Massachusetts. His estate at the time of his death was valued at approximately $300,000, which, in today's terms, is somewhere in the range of $10 million. He was a self-made man, started as a casket maker, which already tells you something about his relationship to discomfort, and built himself into a real estate magnate and banking director. He sat on the boards of several financial institutions. His name meant something in Fall River, and he lived like he was still building. The house at 92 2nd Street had no indoor plumbing on the upper floors, no hot running water, no fashionable renovations, no effort at the kind of comfortable prosperity that a man of his standing would typically have displayed in 1892. He refused, deliberately and stubbornly, to move to the Hill District, the part of town where the old money lived, where his social class was expected to live. His daughters resented it deeply. Emma, the older daughter, who was 41 in the summer of 1892, and Lizzie, who was 32. 2 unmarried women living in their father's house, not calling the shots, not controlling a cent of the fortune they expected to one day inherit, waiting, in a house without hot water on the upper floors, while their father, who could have given them comfort, chose not to. Dark humor aside, that is a particular kind of slow misery. But the resentment had a sharper edge than just a drafty house. A few years before the murders, Andrew Borden had transferred a piece of property, the Ferry Street house, to Abby Borden's half-sister, Sarah Whitehead. This was not incidental. This was a deliberate financial move that redirected wealth away from Lizzie and Emma's expected inheritance and toward Abby's family. The sisters confronted him. As a concession, Andrew gave each daughter a property of roughly equal value. But concessions after the fact do not undo resentment. They just put a lid on it. By 1892, Lizzie Borden did not call her stepmother mother. She called her Mrs. Borden. Let that land for a second. Abby Borden had been in that house since Lizzie was a young girl, and by 1892, the relationship had calcified into something cold enough that Lizzie would not give her the basic warmth of a name. They ate separately when they could manage it. Their communication, according to neighbors and household accounts, was formally distant. This was not a household in temporary tension. This was a household where the estrangement had become permanent, structural, and entirely unaddressed. And Andrew Borden, the man with $10 million and no hot water on the upper floors, sat in the middle of it, apparently unconcerned. Now, there is one more person in this house we need to talk about before August 3rd. Bridget Sullivan, young, Irish-born, and entirely dependent on the Bordens for her roof and her wages. Live-in maid, she washed the Bordens' windows. She cooked their meals. She cleaned their rooms. She was paid the way all domestic workers were paid in 1892, poorly, with the expectation that she would be grateful for the roof. On the morning of August 4th, Bridget Sullivan was outside, washing the exterior windows of the house. She later testified that she had felt ill herself. The whole household had been sick in the days leading up to the murders. And that illness is important, because in the week before August 4th, late July, early August 1892, something happened in that house that nobody in authority took seriously enough. The entire household fell ill with severe vomiting and gastric distress. Andrew, Abby, Bridget, Lizzie too, reportedly. Abby Borden was frightened enough that she went to see the family doctor, Dr. Seabury Bowen, and told him she believed the household had been poisoned. Dr. Bowen dismissed her concern. She was dead within the week. Now, I want you to hold something in the back of your mind as we move forward. Not a conclusion, just a question. If the household had just been through what looked like a poisoning attempt, a week of illness severe enough that the stepmother went to see a doctor in fear, and 3 days after that illness, someone in the same house walked into a drugstore and asked to buy a lethal poison, what would you think? The jury never had to answer that question. But you do, because what happened on August 3rd, the day before Andrew and Abby Borden died, is the first door. And in the next section, we are walking through it, August 3rd, 1892. One day before 2 people are killed in a house on 2nd Street. The morning is already hot. Fall River in August does not offer mercy. And Lizzie Borden leaves the house and walks to a drugstore. D.R. Smith's drugstore on the corner of Main and Columbia Streets. She walks up to the counter and asks for prussic acid. The man behind the counter is Eli Bentz, a drugstore clerk. Not the pharmacist, not the owner, a clerk. He tells her he cannot sell prussic acid without a doctor's prescription. She tells him she has bought it before at the same store. He declines anyway. She leaves. That is the interaction. That is the whole thing. Maybe 3 minutes, maybe less. And that 3-minute exchange, that small, ordinary refusal at a drugstore counter, was the most important thing the jury never heard at the trial of Lizzie Borden. Now, let me tell you what prussic acid actually is, because this matters. Prussic acid is hydrogen cyanide. In 1892, it was available in diluted form for legitimate household purposes, most commonly cited for removing moths from sealskin capes and fur garments. So, the purchase was not inherently suspicious on its face. Women in Victorian households used it. But here is the catch. The quantity and concentration she requested were not a cleaning solution. Prussic acid in the amount she asked for was lethal, and she asked for it the day before both members of her household were killed. Eli Bentz knew enough to say no. Bentz was prepared to testify about this at trial. He was called to the stand on June 14th, 1893, 9 days into the trial. Defense attorneys immediately objected. The The three judges, Blodgett, Dewey, and Mason, heard arguments, and on June 15, 1893, they ruled that Eli Bentz's testimony was inadmissible. Their reasoning, the prussic acid, was never purchased. It was never used. There was no proven causal link between the attempted purchase and the murders. The testimony was prejudicial without sufficient probative value. Eli Bentz went home without testifying. The jury never heard what he had to say about August 3rd. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this case deserves honesty. The legal reasoning behind excluding Bentz's testimony was not invented from nothing. Under the evidentiary standards of 1892, excluding prior bad acts without a direct link to the crime was a defensible position. Some legal historians argue the exclusion was correct. But here is what those same historians acknowledge. The household had just been through an unexplained illness so severe that Abby Borden feared she had been poisoned. And the day before both victims were found dead, the primary suspect in the house attempted to purchase a lethal substance. You do not have to believe Lizzie Borden killed anyone to notice that those two facts, sitting next to each other, constitute a question worth asking. The jury was not allowed to ask it. I said there were 3 doors. The prussic acid is the first. Here is the second, her own words. Because Lizzie Borden testified at the inquest. The pre-trial inquiry, held August 9th through 11, 1892, 5 days after the murders. She was questioned. She answered. She gave an account of her movements on August 4th. And then she gave a different account. And then she adjusted it again. The inquest transcript exists. The contradictions are a matter of historical record, not speculation. She gave at least 2 different accounts of where she was during the 90-minute window when Abby was killed upstairs. In one version, she was in the kitchen. In another, she had already gone to the barn. The timeline shifted between sessions, and on June 10th, 1893, 4 days into the trial, prosecutors tried to introduce that inquest testimony into evidence. Defense attorneys objected on constitutional grounds. Lizzie had not yet been formally charged when she testified. She had not been warned of her right to silence. The testimony, they argued, was obtained under effective compulsion. On June 12, 1893, the 3 judges agreed. Inquest testimony, inadmissible. The jury heard none of the contradictions. They heard no shifting account of where she was during the 90 minutes. Second door, locked. That leaves the third. But the third is different from the other 2. Because unlike the prussic acid testimony and the inquest transcript, both of which were excluded before the jury heard a word, the third piece of evidence was mentioned in court. Alice Russell testified about it. The jury did hear about it. They just could never examine what it proved. Because by the time anyone asked, it had been ash for months. We are going to talk about the dress in Chapter 3. But first, we need to go inside that house on the morning of August 4th. Because whatever happened, however this story ends for you, it starts in a sitting room in Fall River on a Tuesday morning in August with a man who had just fallen asleep on his sofa and never woke up. He came home carrying a small parcel. That is how Tuesday, August 4th ends for Andrew Borden. Not with an argument, not with a confrontation, not with any of the dramatic domestic theater you might expect from a household sitting on years of cold resentment. He just came home from downtown, parcel in hand, walked through his own front door, and lay down on the sitting room sofa. And someone killed him between 10 and 11 blows, sharp-edged instrument, while he slept. Now, let's walk through that morning properly. Not the version from the rhyme, the version from the testimony. Around 7 in the morning, Andrew Borden, his wife Abby, and his brother-in-law John Morse, who had arrived the evening before for a visit, sat down to breakfast together. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, had gone out to the backyard that morning because she felt ill, sick enough to vomit. She had been feeling unwell, as the whole household had, for several days. Morse left around 8:45. Lizzie came down for a light breakfast around 9. A few minutes after 9, Andrew left the house on his morning errands downtown. He took with him some letters Lizzie had reportedly asked him to mail. Here is where the clock becomes important. Between approximately 9 and 9:30 in the morning, Abby Borden went upstairs to the guest bedroom to continue her house cleaning. The medical examiner's report later established that she was killed somewhere in that window, struck 19 times with a sharp-edged instrument, blows concentrated on the back of her head. 19 blows, not 40. The rhyme was wrong on the numbers. History remembered the poetry and forgot the record. While Abby was being killed upstairs, Bridget Sullivan was outside washing the exterior windows of the house. She had a bucket, a cloth, and a clear view of the street. What she did not have was a view of the upstairs guest room. She heard nothing unusual, or said she didn't. Around 10:30, Andrew Borden returned home. He could not get the front door open. It was locked from the inside, which was not the usual arrangement, and Bridget Sullivan had to let him in. And here is one of those details that sits quietly in the record without demanding your attention, but should. As Bridget unlocked the front door, she heard a sound from upstairs, a laugh, or something like one, from upstairs, where Abby Borden's body had been lying on the floor for the better part of an hour. Bridget Sullivan testified to this at trial. Nobody pressed her hard on it. Andrew Borden came inside. Lizzie met him briefly. She told him that Abby had received a message and left the house. Abby was already dead in the guest room, directly above them. Andrew settled onto the sitting room sofa. Bridget went upstairs to her attic room to rest. And sometime in the next few minutes, medical examiners placed Andrew's death between 10:45 and 11:10. He was struck between 10 and 11 times. At roughly 11:10, Lizzie called up the stairs to Bridget. "Maggie, come quick! Father's dead! Somebody came in and killed him!" Not, "Something has happened." Not, "I think I heard something." "Father's dead." The neighbor Adelaide Churchill was summoned. Police were notified shortly after 11:15. Within hours, 92 2nd Street was full of officers, doctors, and reporters, and Lizzie Borden, standing in the middle of all of it, was already being asked a question she could not answer cleanly. Where had she been? She said she was in the barn. That was her answer. When police asked Lizzie Borden where she had been at the time her father was killed, she said she had been in the loft of the barn at the back of the property, the outbuilding Andrew had used just months before to kill a flock of pigeons that had been roosting there. She told neighbor Adelaide Churchill first she had been in the barn looking for iron sinkers, fishing weights, for an upcoming trip. It is a very specific detail. Iron sinkers, a fishing trip, the loft. The problem is not that she gave an alibi. The problem is what investigators found when they went to check it. Officers who examined the barn loft shortly after the murders reported that the dust on the floor was undisturbed. No footprints, no compressed hay, no evidence that anyone had climbed up there and spent time searching through the loft on a hot August morning. The barn in August, with the doors closed and the sun on the roof, would have been stifling. One officer who went up there to check described the heat as nearly unbearable. The kind of heat that makes you turn around in 60 seconds, not linger and search for fishing weights. No sinkers were ever found. No fishing trip was confirmed for the near future. But here's the part that makes the alibi more complicated than just a dust pattern on a floor. Before Andrew came home, when Abby was already dead upstairs and the house was otherwise quiet, what was Lizzie doing? Her accounts across the inquest varied. In one version, she was in the kitchen. In another, she had already moved toward the barn. The sequence and timing shifted between the first day of inquest testimony and the last. And here is the detail from the famous trial's chronology that sits without comment in the historical record and deserves far more attention than it typically gets. When Andrew came home at 10:45, Lizzie met him briefly. She told him Abby had gone out after receiving a note. Investigators later searched for that note. They asked about it directly. No note was ever found. No messenger who delivered it was ever identified. Nobody outside the Borden household had seen Abby leave, because Abby had not left. She was upstairs. Now. I'm not telling you what to conclude from that. What I'm telling you is that Lizzie Borden, at some point before her father settled on the sofa, told him a story about a note and a departure that had not happened. Whether she told him that story because she was protecting him from a shock he was not ready for, or because she had another reason to keep him from going upstairs. That question is one the jury was structurally prevented from sitting with, because her inquest testimony about this sequence was ruled inadmissible. So instead, the jury heard only what the trial testimony allowed, and the trial testimony was narrower, cleaner, and considerably less troubling than what the inquest record contained. There is a detail about Bridget Sullivan worth returning to here. Not because Bridget is a suspect, because she isn't, and historians who have speculated otherwise have done so without evidence, but because her testimony contains something that has never been fully resolved. She heard a laugh from upstairs when she opened the front door for Andrew. Abby's body was upstairs. Bridget was downstairs. Andrew was at the door. Lizzie's location at that precise moment is not cleanly established in the trial record. The laugh from upstairs was noted by Bridget Sullivan under oath. No one in the courtroom explained it. No one today can. And then Andrew Borden lay down on the sofa, and someone came into the sitting room while he slept. And the last morning he ever had ended the way only the most violent of mornings end. The hatchet head found in the basement afterward had its handle broken off. The break appeared fresh. The head showed evidence of having been cleaned with ash. 1892. Forensic science could not definitively match it to the wounds. It remains the closest thing to a murder weapon that this case ever produced. And it was found in the basement of the house, where the primary suspect lived. There is still one more person in this story we haven't talked about enough. Not Lizzie, not Andrew, not Bridget. The man who arrived the night before. John Vinicum Morse, Andrew's brother-in-law, Abby's relative, the man whose family had received the Ferry Street property transfer that ignited the inheritance resentment in the first place. He arrived August 3rd. He was in the house on the morning of August 4th. He left before the killings. He came back afterward and, according to witnesses, went directly to the pear tree in the backyard and began eating pears, not asking about the bodies, not asking what had happened, eating pears. He was never charged. He was never seriously considered by investigators. He gave an alibi that was verified. History moved on. But the pear tree detail has never entirely left the record. and some historians have never entirely forgiven investigators for how quickly they moved past him. That is not the same as guilt, but it is not nothing either. 5 days after 2 people were killed inside her home, Lizzie Borden sat down in the Fall River Court building and answered questions for 3 days straight. August 9th, 10th, and 11th, 1892. The inquest was not a trial. There was no jury. It was a pre-trial inquiry before Judge Josiah C. Blaisdell, a formal process designed to determine whether there was sufficient cause to pursue criminal charges. Witnesses could be compelled to appear and testify. And for significant portions of that questioning, Lizzie Borden was answering questions without her attorney actively present to advise her. This was legally permissible in 1892 Massachusetts. It was also, depending on how you read the record, either the most natural thing in the world for an innocent woman, or a structural trap that produced testimony her lawyers would spend the next 10 months trying to keep out of court. They succeeded. But before we get to the exclusion, we need to talk about what she actually said, because the inquest transcript is a matter of public record. The contradictions in it are documented, not constructed. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton asked her, across 3 sessions, to account for her movements on the morning of August 4th. And her answers, session to session, question to question, did not hold a clean, consistent shape. On where she was when Abby was being killed upstairs, she gave at least 2 different accounts. In one version, she was in the kitchen. In another, she was already moving toward the barn. The sequence of when she decided to go to the barn shifted between the first day and the last. On her relationship with Abby, when Knowlton asked directly whether she was on good terms with her stepmother, her responses were evasive in ways that contradicted what neighbors and household acquaintances had already told investigators about the temperature of that household. On the note that supposedly called Abby away from the house, she maintained that Abby had received a message and gone out. She could not say who delivered it, or what it said, or how she knew its contents. Knowlton pressed her. She held to the note. The note never materialized. And then, on August 11th, the 3rd and final day of the inquest, Lizzie Borden was arrested. She was charged with the murders of Andrew Borden and Abby Borden. She spent roughly 9 months in the Taunton jail awaiting trial. On June 10th, 1893, 4 days into the trial, prosecutors attempted to place the inquest transcript into evidence. They wanted the jury to hear what she had said under oath 5 days after the murders, before her legal team had time to smooth the edges of her account. Defense attorney George D. Robinson, former governor of Massachusetts, the most powerful lawyer in the room, a man who had himself appointed one of the sitting judges, objected. His argument: she had not been formally charged when she testified. She had not been warned of her right to silence. The testimony was obtained under compulsion and could not be used against her constitutionally. On June 12, 1893, the 3 judges agreed. The inquest transcript was sealed from the jury. They never heard the shifting accounts. They never heard the question she could not answer consistently. They never heard 3 days of a woman trying to hold a story together under oath and not quite managing it. What they heard instead was the trial testimony, a version of events shaped by months of preparation, a formidable legal team, and the cleaner, more considered account that Lizzie Borden gave from the witness stand when she had counsel beside her. And here's the part of this that tends to get lost when people reduce this case to a simple verdict. The exclusion of the inquest testimony was not necessarily wrong on the law. The constitutional argument Robinson made had genuine merit by 1892 standards. But the effect of that legally defensible exclusion was that the jury was asked to evaluate a woman's credibility without access to the 3 days of sworn testimony in which her account of the most important morning of her life visibly shifted. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the entire architecture of why 68 minutes was enough. Remove the poison attempt, seal the inquest, and what you have left is a Sunday school teacher from a prominent family, dressed respectably, with a former governor defending her, and a judge on the bench who owed that governor a professional debt. What you have left is exactly what the jury saw. Which brings us to the third door, the one the jury did hear about, just not in time to do anything with. She burned a dress 3 days after her parents were found dead. A neighbor saw it. A friend of the family testified to it under oath. The jury was told, and the dress was ash. That story is coming. But first, we need to talk about the courtroom itself, because the trial of Lizzie Borden was not just a legal proceeding. It was a performance. And some of the most important staging happened before a single witness sat down. Here is something nobody tells you about the trial of Lizzie Borden. The most powerful man in that courtroom was not the prosecutor. He was not the judge. He was sitting at the defense table. George D. Robinson was 60 years old in the summer of 1893. He had spent 6 years as a congressman and 3 years as governor of Massachusetts. He had appointed judges. He had shaped careers. He had walked into rooms where deals were made before anyone else arrived. And he had a habit of making sure those deals landed his way. When the Borden family retained him to defend Lizzie, they were not just hiring a lawyer. They were hiring the man who had built part of the architecture of Massachusetts justice. And one of the judges sitting on the bench at that trial, Judge Justin Dewey, owed that architecture, at least in part, to Robinson. He had been appointed to the Superior Court bench by Robinson himself when Robinson was governor. Documented fact. No editorializing required. Now, I want you to hold that in your hand for a moment, not as a conspiracy, not as a scandal, just as a fact about a room. Because everything that happens inside that New Bedford courtroom across the next 14 days becomes just a little bit different when you understand who is standing where and what they owe whom. The prosecution did not walk in weak. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton had spent almost a year building this case. He had the inquest transcript, 3 days of testimony, in which Lizzie's account of her own movements shifted in ways a prosecutor would normally salivate over. He had the testimony of Eli Bentz, the drugstore clerk who had refused to sell prussic acid to Lizzie Borden the morning before both victims were killed. He had a dress that no longer existed. He had a murder weapon that had been cleaned with ash and found in the basement of the house where the primary suspect lived. He also had, sitting beside him at the prosecution table, a lawyer named William H. Moody, a man who would one day be appointed to the United States Supreme Court. The prosecution that lost this case eventually produced a Supreme Court justice. Let that sit there for a second, because they lost. And understanding why they lost is not really about Lizzie Borden at all. It is about what a courtroom can and cannot see when the most important evidence has already been removed before the jury walks in. By the time June 5th arrived, the first day of trial, 2 of the 3 keys had already been turned. The inquest testimony sealed on June 12th, before the trial even properly began. Eli Bentz, removed from the witness list on June 15th, 4 days in. What remained was the dress, and a question that had no clean answer Robinson did not argue that someone else had killed Andrew and Abby Borden. Think about that choice for a moment. Think about how unusual it is. In a murder defense, the simplest path is almost always to point somewhere else, to give the jury a door marked other suspect and ask them to consider it. Robinson never opened that door. His argument was something more elegant and more dangerous. He argued that Lizzie Borden was not the kind of person who could have done this. Not didn't do it, not couldn't have done it physically. The argument was quieter than that and heavier than that at the same time. It was the argument that a Sunday school teacher, a church-going woman from a respectable family, a daughter who had lived her whole life inside the rules of Victorian propriety, such a woman could not have produced this level of violence. And here is the part that makes it impossible to simply dismiss. He was right about how that jury thought. The 12 men in that box were not anomalies. They were products of their world. And in 1893, the world they came from had very specific ideas about what respectable womanhood looked like, what it was capable of, and what it required of a gentleman sitting in judgment. A well-dressed woman who wept at appropriate moments. A woman who had no history of violence. A woman who had fainted, reportedly, when the bodies were brought out. A woman who attended Central Congregational Church and taught Sunday school and had, by every available social signal, behaved exactly as her class and gender required for 32 years. Robinson dressed her carefully for every session. The courtroom watched a grieving daughter, not a suspect. And the prosecution's problem, the deep structural problem that no amount of legal skill could fully overcome, was that the evidence they were most forbidden to use was precisely the evidence that would have complicated that picture. The inquest testimony would have shown a woman whose story changed. The prussic acid would have shown a woman who tried to buy poison the day before her parents died. What the jury could see instead was a woman who sat quietly and wept and looked like exactly what Robinson told them she was. There is a word for this. It is not strategy. It is theater. Very expensive, very effective theater, and Robinson was its director. But here is where this chapter gets uncomfortable, because Robinson was not alone in staging it. On June 19th, after both sides had delivered their closing arguments, Judge Justin Dewey stood up and spoke directly to the jury. What he said has been described by legal historians as, in practical effect, a second closing argument for the defense. Not a neutral summary, not an impartial overview of the evidence. A methodical walk through the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, framed in the careful, measured language of judicial authority, which made it more persuasive than anything Robinson had said, because it came from the bench. He emphasized the lack of direct evidence. He emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses. He emphasized the character of the defendant. He did not tell the jury to acquit. He did not have to. Language has weight when it comes from the bench, and the weight of Dewey's charge pressed in one direction. Now, I am not telling you Dewey was corrupt. The historical record does not allow that conclusion. What the historical record does allow, what it requires, actually, is the observation that a judge who had been appointed to his seat by the lead defense attorney delivered a charge that bent toward that defense attorney's argument. You can call that coincidence. Historians differ on what to call it, but it is a fact. And facts have the uncomfortable habit of meaning something, whether you name them or not. The jury retired at 3:24 in the afternoon on June 20th, 1893. There was one more thing the jury heard, not the poison, not the inquest, but this, a neighbor's quiet, devastating account of something she watched happen in a kitchen on a Sunday morning. Alice Russell was a family friend who had been staying at 92 2nd Street in the days after the murders. There for support, for company, for whatever a household needs when it has just become a crime scene. On August 7th, 1892, 3 days after both bodies were found, Alice Russell stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Lizzie Borden feed a dress into the kitchen stove. She testified to this at trial, under oath, in the courtroom in front of the jury. This was not sealed. This was not struck from the record. The jury heard every word of it. Lizzie's explanation, offered at the time to those present: the dress was stained with paint. Old paint. She was clearing out soiled things. No paint was ever confirmed. No witness verified the paint. And here is the detail that makes Alice Russell's testimony something other than a simple account of household cleaning. When Russell first saw Lizzie at the stove, she said something to her. The exact words vary slightly across accounts, but the meaning is consistent. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." She knew, before she was asked, before anyone pressed her. Alice Russell stood in that kitchen doorway and felt, in whatever way a human being feels something without being able to name it clearly, that what she was watching was not a woman cleaning out a closet. She testified to it anyway. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, an act of considerable courage from someone who was Lizzie's friend. The jury heard about a dress that had been burned. They were told it existed. They were told when it was burned and who burned it and what she claimed was on it. And they were never able to look at it, never able to hand it to an expert, never able to ask the question that the burning made permanently unanswerable. The barn loft had no footprints. The basement had a hatchet with a fresh broken handle, cleaned with ash. The kitchen stove had a dress that was now beyond examination. And the woman at the center of all three of those objects was sitting very still in a respectable dress in a courtroom designed not by conspiracy, but by the accumulated weight of law, gender, and power, to see her clearly as a grieving daughter, and not quite clearly enough as anything else. At 4:32 in the afternoon, 68 minutes after they left the room, the jury came back. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. People cheered in the streets outside. Newspapers ran headlines that read like relief, like vindication, like the natural order of things asserting itself. Lizzie Borden walked out of that courtroom a free woman. And within a matter of months, she did something that nobody who knew her father could quite reconcile with the portrait of the modest, grieving daughter the defense had placed before the jury. She bought a house, not just any house. The biggest house she could find on the hill, the fashionable hill, the one Andrew Borden had refused to move to for his entire adult life. The address that announced arrival and money and standing in Fall River in a way the plain rooms of 92 2nd Street never had. She named it Maplecroft. She had the name carved into the front step. The barn at 92 2nd Street had no footprints in the loft dust. The ledger of the Borden estate, $300,000, roughly $10 million in today's terms, was open now, and the only name left to fill it was hers. And upstairs at Maplecroft, in a house built on hill money and acquittal, the door to every room that the jury never opened stayed exactly as they had left it, closed. There is one more person in this story. She left in 1905. She never came back. She never explained why. And what Emma Borden took with her when she walked out of Maplecroft, whatever she knew, whatever she had seen, whatever she had decided she could no longer be inside the same house as, she carried it until the day she died. Without saying a word, she got exactly what she had always wanted. That is the part of this story that tends to make people go quiet for a second. Not the murders, not the trial, not the 68 minutes, but this, the aftermath. Because the aftermath is where the story stops being about what happened in that house and starts being about what it meant that she walked away from it. Within months of her acquittal, Lizzie Borden purchased a 14-room Victorian house at 306 French Street, top of the hill, Fall River, the neighborhood her father had spent his entire adult life refusing to live in. Andrew Borden had been one of the wealthiest men in the city. He had banking directorships, real estate holdings, textile connections, and an estate worth approximately $300,000 at his death. And he had chosen, deliberately, stubbornly, in a way his daughters found humiliating, to keep the family in a plain house on 2nd Street with no indoor plumbing on the upper floors and no fashionable renovations. Not because he couldn't afford better, because he refused. The hill was where Fall River's money displayed itself. Andrew Borden had money and would not go there. Lizzie went immediately. She named the house Maplecroft, and she had the name carved into the front step, not painted, not affixed with a plaque, carved permanent, as though she were writing something into the record that could not be removed. She was 32 years old. She had just been acquitted of killing her father and stepmother. She had inherited what records suggest was a substantial portion of a $300,000 estate. And she built herself the life Andrew's money had always been capable of providing, and never did. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not telling you that buying a nice house after a murder acquittal is evidence of guilt. People build new lives after terrible things. That is not the point. The point is the name carved in stone. The point is the hill. The point is that everything Lizzie Borden did in the years after the trial tells a story that is just slightly harder to square with the portrait Robinson painted in that courtroom. The modest daughter, the grieving child, the woman too gentle for violence. That woman went home to Maplecroft and threw parties. She befriended actresses. She hosted theater people. She traveled. She changed her name, started going by Lisbeth, not Lizzie, as if the trial name belonged to someone else. Fall River watched all of this with its arms folded, and eventually Fall River closed its doors to her entirely. Acquittal in a courtroom is not the same thing as acquittal in a town. The jury said not guilty in 68 minutes. Fall River took considerably longer to render its own verdict, and what it decided was quieter, slower, and in many ways more permanent than anything that happened in New Bedford. The social circles Lizzie had occupied before August 4th, 1892, the church community, the charitable organizations, the respectable visiting networks of upper-middle-class Fall River, those circles did not reopen when she came home. People stopped calling. Invitations stopped coming. The kind of small daily acknowledgments that make up the texture of a respectable life in a small city. The nods, the conversations after Sunday service, the inclusion in the social rounds of women her age and class. Those things simply evaporated. She was not threatened. She was not harassed in any documented way. She was ignored, which, in the world she had grown up inside, was its own kind of punishment. And here's the detail about that social exile that tends to get lost in the broader story. She didn't leave. She had the money to go anywhere. She had a full inheritance, a large house, and no obvious obligation to remain in the city that had tried her for murder. But she stayed in Fall River for the rest of her life, 34 more years inside the place that would not take her back. Historians have never fully explained why. Some have suggested she was stubborn, that leaving would have felt like admission, that Maplecroft on the hill was its own kind of argument. I am still here. I was acquitted. I owe you nothing. Others have suggested something harder to name, that she was trapped not by circumstance, but by the story. That Fall River was the only place where the story existed, and leaving it would have meant leaving the only context in which her life made any sense at all. Whatever the reason, she stayed. And the house on the hill, which had started as a symbol of everything she had finally obtained, gradually became something closer to a cage she had furnished herself. For the first several years after the trial, Emma was there. Emma Borden, the older sister, the one who had been visiting friends in Fairhaven when the murders happened, the one who had come home to a crime scene and then stood beside her sister through the arrest and the 9 months in Taunton jail and the trial and the acquittal. Emma moved into Maplecroft with Lizzie. They had survived the most catastrophic event imaginable together. They were, by every available account, the last people standing inside a family that no longer existed in any other form. And then, in 1905, 12 years after the acquittal, Emma Borden packed her things and left Maplecroft. She moved to a boarding house. She gave no public statement. She offered no recorded explanation. She never moved back. And from that point until both sisters died, Lizzie in June 1927, Emma 9 days later, they did not speak. 12 years. Then silence. Then nothing. Now. The outline for this documentary is very specific about what we cannot do here. We cannot say Emma knew something. We cannot say Emma witnessed something. We cannot say Emma's departure was an admission of any kind, because there is no evidence that supports any of those claims. What we can say is this: something happened. In 1905, inside Maplecroft, between two women who had shared the worst experience of their lives and then shared a house for over a decade. Something changed, and Emma, who had already lost her father and stepmother, had already endured a public murder trial, had already watched Fall River turn its back on her family name. Emma decided that whatever was inside that house was worse than being alone in Newmarket, New Hampshire, for the rest of her life. That is not evidence, but it is a fact, and facts have weight even when we can't fully interpret them. The most common historical explanation, the one that biographers most frequently point to, centers on Lizzie's friendship with Nance O'Neill, a Boston actress she had become close to in the early 1900s. Emma reportedly disapproved of the relationship and of the theatrical social world Lizzie had built around herself at Maplecroft. The parties, the performers, the life that looked nothing like the respectable Victorian household they had both grown up inside. That is the practical explanation, and it may be entirely correct. But here's the thing about the practical explanation that has always bothered careful historians. Disapproval of an actress friend, even strong, principled Victorian disapproval, does not typically produce 12 years of total silence between the last two surviving members of a family. Disapproval produces arguments, cooling of relations, distance, not this, not permanent, wordless, absolute severance that lasted until both women died. The barn in this story has always been the physical symbol of what one person had and another didn't, a safety net, a fallback, the difference between risk taken from solid ground and risk taken from the edge. Emma had no barn. After 1905, she had no house, no family, no name that opened doors. She lived quietly in Newmarket, New Hampshire, and carried the particular silence of a woman who has decided, that what she knows is not something she is going to say out loud. She never said it. Lizzie died June 1st, 1927. Emma died June 10th, 9 days later. They did not reconcile. Let me take you back to something. Not to the courtroom, not to the barn loft. Back to the moment before any of it. Back to the idea of a ledger. A ledger is just a record. 2 columns. What came in, what went out, what was gained, what was lost. You don't need to editorialize a ledger. You just need to read it. Here's what the ledger of this case contains. On August 3rd, 1892, a drugstore clerk named Eli Bentz refused to sell prussic acid to Lizzie Borden. He was prepared to say so under oath. On June 15th, 1893, the 3 judges ruled that what he had to say was inadmissible, that an attempted poison purchase the day before 2 people were killed was insufficiently connected to their deaths to be placed before a jury. Eli Bentz went home without testifying. That is the first door. On August 9th through 11th, 1892, 5 days after the murders, Lizzie Borden testified for 3 days at an inquest proceeding. Her account of where she was during the 90-minute window between Abby's death and Andrew's shifted across those sessions. The sequence changed. The details moved. The story that emerged on the 3rd day was not quite the same as the story offered on the 1st. On June 12, 1893, that transcript was ruled inadmissible. The jury never heard any of it. That is the second door. On August 7, 1892, Alice Russell stood in the kitchen doorway of 92 2nd Street and watched Lizzie Borden burn a dress. She said, under oath, at trial, where the jury could hear her, that Lizzie fed the garment into the kitchen stove and said it was stained with paint. No paint was confirmed. No paint was documented. And the dress, by the time Alice Russell told the jury about it, had been ash for months. The jury heard that the dress existed. They were told when it was burned and who burned it. And they were permanently, irreversibly unable to examine what it might have shown them. Because examining ash tells you nothing about what the cloth contained before the fire. That is the 3rd door. 3 doors. 2 locked before the jury arrived. 1 left technically open, with the most important part of what was behind it already gone. The jury deliberated for 68 minutes and returned a verdict of not guilty. Abby Borden had been dead in that upstairs guest room for 90 minutes before Andrew Borden was killed on the sofa below her. The jury took less time to decide there was nothing to answer for than it had taken, on that August morning, for both of them to die. That is not an argument. That is arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike testimony, cannot be ruled inadmissible. What happened inside 92 2nd Street on August 4th, 1892, has never been conclusively resolved. There are historians who believe Lizzie Borden was guilty and was protected by the combined weight of class, gender, legal maneuvering, and a judge who owed a favor to the man defending her. There are historians who believe the evidence was genuinely insufficient, and the acquittal was the right verdict under the law as it existed. Both of those positions live in the record. I am not here to resolve them. What I am here to say is this. The version of this story that the jury heard was not the whole story. It was the story that remained after the poison was removed, and the inquest was sealed, and the dress was ash, and a former governor stood in front of 12 men and told them that a woman who looked like Lizzie Borden simply could not have done something like this. They believed him. Maybe they were right to. But the ledger, that quiet, unforgiving ledger, with its 2 columns and its rows that don't balance, the ledger has never closed. Maplecroft is still standing on French Street in Fall River. The name is still carved into the front step. and the 3 doors are exactly where the jury left them. Somewhere between the New Bedford courtroom and the schoolyard, the whole complicated architecture of this case got compressed into 4 lines. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. And when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. That rhyme. You probably already knew it before you knew a single actual fact about what happened in that house. And that is exactly the problem, because the rhyme is not history. The rhyme is what history looks like after it gets laundered through vaudeville stages, penny newspapers, and 30 years of repetition until the only thing left is the punchline. Let's start with what the rhyme gets wrong, because the wrongness is not accidental. It is instructive. Abby Borden was struck approximately 18 times. Andrew was struck approximately 11. The rhyme gives both of them 40 whacks plus 1, numbers that are almost double the documented strike count on one victim and nearly 4 times the count on the other. Nobody was struck 40 times. Nobody was struck 41 times. Those numbers were invented because 40 and 41 rhyme, and rhyming was more important than accuracy, and accuracy was never really the point. And there is a detail even quieter than the wrong numbers. The rhyme calls Abby Borden her mother. She was not her mother, she was her stepmother. A woman Lizzie called Mrs. Borden by the time she reached adulthood, a distance that the trial record makes visible, a distinction that the investigators and prosecutors found significant, and a fact that the rhyme simply deleted. 4 syllables, stepmother, didn't fit the meter. So it became mother, and a whole layer of the domestic friction inside that house, a layer the prosecution had spent months trying to make a jury understand, got smoothed away in the interest of a clean beat. This is how myth works, not through dramatic rewriting, through small compressions that seem harmless individually and become profound collectively. The rhyme did not appear during the trial. It did not appear during the inquest. It surfaced years later, around the turn of the 20th century, first on vaudeville stages, where it was deployed as the kind of punchy, darkly comic material that audiences of that era genuinely loved. And then it migrated into newspapers, and from newspapers into schoolyards, and from schoolyards into something so embedded in American cultural memory that generations of children could recite it without knowing who Lizzie Borden actually was, what she was actually accused of, or what the words not guilty and not innocent do and do not mean. By the 1920s, the rhyme was in print. By the 1930s, it appeared in children's books. Children's books. I want you to sit with that for a second. A rhyme about a woman suspected of killing her father and stepmother. A woman who was acquitted but never exonerated, who lived the rest of her life in a city that would not receive her, who may or may not have committed 2 of the most violent acts in Massachusetts criminal history. That rhyme ended up in children's books by the 1930s because the 4 lines were so clean, so rhythmically satisfying, that the actual content had stopped mattering. The form consumed the story. And once the form consumed the story could no longer ask the questions it was supposed to be asking. Here is what the rhyme cannot contain. A drugstore clerk turned away at the courthouse door. An inquest transcript ruled inadmissible. A burned dress and an ash pile where evidence used to be. A former governor standing in front of a jury. A judge he had personally appointed sitting 6 feet away, and 12 men who had already been told by a culture that had never let a woman vote that a woman of Lizzie Borden's class and respectability simply could not have done this. None of that fits in 4 lines. None of that has a beat you can clap to. So it was left out, and what replaced it was a counting song Here is something that tends to get lost in the counting song version of this story. The jury in New Bedford in June of 1893 was not deciding whether Lizzie Borden killed her father and stepmother. Not exactly. Not in the way people assume. They were deciding something more specific and more procedural than that. They were deciding whether the evidence placed before them, the evidence that had survived the 3 locked doors, the evidence that had not been ruled inadmissible, the evidence that was still standing after the inquest transcript was sealed, and Eli Bence was sent home and the dress became ash, whether that evidence, and only that evidence, was sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a different question, and it is worth understanding why it is different. The legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt exists for reasons that are worth respecting. It exists because the consequences of wrongful conviction are catastrophic, because the state has enormous power over the individual, and because a justice system that convicts on thin evidence destroys more than it protects. Those are not small considerations. They are foundational. But here is what that standard does not do. It does not establish innocence. It establishes insufficiency of proof. An insufficiency of proof can come from 2 completely different sources. It can come from the fact that a person is genuinely not guilty, or it can come from the fact that the evidence that might have proven guilt was not permitted to be heard. The jury in the Borden case never saw the inquest transcript. They never heard Eli Bence. They never held the dress in their hands and asked the questions a jury is supposed to ask about physical evidence. They decided on the basis of what they were given. What they were given had been shaped by rulings, by precedent, by a legal architecture that did not arrive at the courthouse neutrally. It arrived in the briefcase of a man who had spent years building that architecture from the inside, who knew exactly which doors to push and which arguments to make, and who could look at a bench occupied partly by a judge he had appointed and know, with the quiet confidence of a man who understood where power actually lived, that he was not entirely in unfamiliar territory. And surrounding all of that, surrounding the briefcase and the bench and the sealed transcript and the missing dress, was a cultural assumption so deep and so unexamined that it barely needed to be spoken aloud. Women of Lizzie Borden's background did not do things like this. That was the argument. Not dressed up as an argument, exactly. Dressed up as common sense. Dressed up as observation. The defense asked the jury to look at her and simply to see that she was not the kind of person. They said it directly in closing. They asked 12 men to look at this woman and confirm what they already believed about women of her class, her church membership, her charitable work, her respectable name. The prosecution had spent months building a case. The defense spent the closing argument asking 12 men to trust their assumptions. The assumptions won, and this is where the case stops being only about Lizzie Borden and starts being about something considerably larger. According to some accounts, the suffragist Mary Livermore visited Lizzie Borden in the Taunton jail before the trial. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union sent telegrams of support. Feminist voices across the country watched this trial and named in real time something the jury would not name: that a woman being tried without a single female juror, in a legal system women could not fully participate in because they could not vote, was not being judged by her peers in any meaningful sense of that phrase. She was being judged by 12 men who had been taught by the culture they lived in exactly which kind of woman was capable of violence and which was not. She was the second kind. And the question that has never been resolved, that the 68-minute verdict cannot and does not resolve, is whether that cultural certainty protected an innocent woman from an unjust prosecution or protected a guilty woman from the consequences of what she did. Both of those possibilities live inside the same 68 minutes. Both of them live inside the same not guilty verdict. And the rhyme, with its clean beat and its wrong numbers and its 4 lines that land perfectly every single time, has been burying that question under schoolyard rhythm for over 100 years. Let's talk about who was paying attention to this trial, because the people watching are as important as the people testifying. The Borden trial was not a local story that happened to get some press. It was a national event. Reporters from newspapers across the country packed into that New Bedford courtroom. Columnists who normally covered society pages and political affairs showed up with their notebooks and found themselves watching something that made the usual categories: crime story, society story, women's story, political story, inadequate. Because this case was all of those things simultaneously. For a large part of the country, Lizzie Borden represented a specific anxiety about what happened when the domestic world, the world of the proper home, the respectable household, the carefully maintained boundary between women's sphere and men's sphere that Victorian America had spent decades constructing. What happened when that world cracked open? If a woman like Lizzie Borden, church-going, charitable, educated, from a recognizable family in a recognizable town, if she could do something like this, then the entire architecture of trust built around the domestic sphere was in question. The logic ran deeper than crime. It ran into the foundations of how that society organized itself. The conservative response was to insist she couldn't have done it, because insisting otherwise required acknowledging something nobody in 1893 wanted to acknowledge about the world they lived in. The feminist response was different, and it was sharper. The feminist argument in 1893 was not that Lizzie Borden was innocent. The feminist argument was that a trial in which she had no female jurors, no meaningful female legal representation at the institutional level, and no vote in the system that would judge her was not a fair trial in any structural sense, regardless of outcome. They were not wrong. A woman could be convicted in that courtroom. A woman could also be acquitted. But the terms on which either thing happened were set entirely by men, applied by men, and filtered through assumptions about women that women had no formal mechanism to challenge or correct. Lizzie Borden was acquitted. Mary Livermore and the suffragists who watched the trial did not celebrate that acquittal as a victory. They used it as evidence of a different argument entirely, that a justice system women could not participate in was not equipped to render reliable verdicts about women. That argument did not win anything in 1893. It took another 27 years before American women could vote, and by then, the rhyme was already in the schoolyards, and the complicated feminist critique of the Borden verdict had been replaced by a counting song, and the question of what kind of justice 1893 Fall River was capable of offering a woman on trial for her life had been buried under 40 whacks and 41. Go back to the ledger. I introduced it early in this documentary as a simple image, an old farm account book, 2 columns, what came in and what went out. I connected it first to the economics of the case. Andrew Borden's $300,000, the house on 2nd Street that refused to be upgraded, the hill that Lizzie reached the moment the verdict came in. But a ledger is also a record of what gets entered and what gets left out. And every ledger has a category called omissions, things that existed but were not recorded, numbers that were present in the original transaction but never made it into the official column. The Borden trial ledger has 3 entries on the omissions line. an attempted poison purchase that the court decided could not be spoken aloud in the presence of the jury. 3 days of testimony given under oath, in which the story of August 4th shifted in ways that typically make prosecutors certain they are looking at a guilty person, and which the jury never heard. A dress burned in a kitchen stove, reduced to ash before anyone with authority could examine it. 3 omissions. 3 items that entered the historical record as absences rather than evidence. 3 things the jury was not permitted to weigh. And here is what the ledger shows when you look at both columns honestly. The prosecution had witnesses. It had physical evidence, or had it until the stove. It had a timeline with a window in it that had never been satisfactorily explained. It had an inquest in which the suspect's account of her own movements on the morning of the murders changed across 3 consecutive days. The defense had George Robinson. It had cultural certainty. It had a judge who owed his seat on that bench to the man standing at the defense table. And it had, most powerfully of all, a room that already knew, before testimony began, what kind of verdict it was supposed to reach. Those are both real things, both of them. And the ledger cannot tell you which side was right, because a ledger can only record what it is given. The 3 omissions mean the ledger was never given everything. The full accounting, the one that might have answered the question definitively, was ruled out of existence, burned in a stove, and sent home from the courthouse before it ever had the chance to be weighed. What the ledger can tell you is this: the outcome was not produced by evidence alone. It was produced by evidence, plus exclusions, plus assumptions, plus the specific gravity of who was sitting where and what they owed each other. Now, I want to come back to the barn one last time, because the barn has been the physical symbol underneath this entire story. The idea of a safety net, the difference between risk taken from solid ground and risk taken from nothing but belief and hope and the willingness to try. Lizzie Borden had a barn, not a farm barn, a carriage barn. The barn at 92 2nd Street that she said she was in or around, or perhaps climbing up into the loft of during the 90-minute window between one death and the other. The barn that police searched and found undisturbed, no evidence of fresh footprints in the dust of the loft floor that would confirm a person had recently been up there. The barn whose condition at the time of the search was contested by the defense and noted by the prosecution, and ultimately, like so many other things in this case, never definitively resolved. She was in the barn, she said, getting lead sinkers for a planned fishing trip. In August, the barn did not save her and did not condemn her. It sat at the edge of the evidence, neither full enough to be a comfort nor empty enough to be a proof. Just a building with a disputed loft and a question nobody could answer with certainty. But the barn in the broader story, the barn as symbol, did what barns always do in this documentary. It showed you what was behind the person when the moment of judgment came. Behind Lizzie Borden in that courtroom was a $300,000 estate, a former governor, a cultural assumption that women like her were incapable of what she was accused of, and 3 pieces of evidence that had been quietly removed from the scales before the weighing began. That is a substantial barn. Whether the person it protected was innocent or guilty is the question this case has never answered. What it has answered, quietly in the ledger columns, in the 3 locked doors, in the 68 minutes of deliberation, in the courtroom architecture of New Bedford in 1893, is that the barn was there, and it worked exactly the way barns always work. It held. 92 2nd Street is a bed and breakfast now. You can book a room. You can sleep in the house where Andrew Borden died on the sitting room sofa. You can eat breakfast in the morning in the kitchen where Alice Russell stood in the doorway and watched a blue dress feed into the stove. People do this. Hundreds of people a year make a reservation specifically because of what happened there, because the story is compelling in the way that unresolved things are always compelling, not because they are clean, but because they are not. Maplecroft is a private residence. The name is still in the front step. The Taunton jail where Lizzie spent 9 months waiting for trial no longer stands in its original form. The New Bedford courthouse where Robinson performed and Knowlton built his case, and the jury deliberated for 68 minutes, has been preserved as a historic building. The drugstore where Eli Bentz refused to sell prussic acid to a woman he identified as Lizzie Borden. The drugstore that produced a witness the jury never heard, no longer exists in any form that can be visited. Some of the evidence of this case was locked out. Some of it was burned, and some of it simply dissolved into the ordinary passage of time that takes buildings and people and certainties and turns them, eventually, into questions with no remaining physical address. Here's the honest accounting. Nobody was ever convicted of killing Andrew and Abby Borden. The only person who was formally charged, tried, and acquitted was Lizzie. No subsequent investigation named another suspect with enough evidence to charge. The case was never formally closed in the sense of producing a different answer. It remained officially open in theory and practically dormant in practice, and eventually the people who had been in that house, the witnesses, the investigators, the attorneys, the judges, they all died. And the primary record became the trial transcript and the newspaper archives and the inquest documents that had been sealed from the jury and were later released to historians. The historians disagree, not performatively, not because the case is fashionably ambiguous. They disagree because the evidence that survives is genuinely incomplete, and incomplete evidence supports more than one interpretation. And anyone who tells you this case is settled in either direction, guilt or innocence, is telling you something the record does not actually support. What the record supports is a picture of a trial shaped by forces that had nothing to do with the question the jury was nominally answering. It supports a picture of evidence management in 1893 that served specific interests. It supports a picture of a woman whose acquittal may have been just, may have been wrong, and was certainly, without question, documented in every account of this case. Assisted by class, by gender assumptions, by legal maneuvering, and by the particular social gravity of a man who had spent 30 years building the room he was now standing in. That is not nothing. That is not everything. That is what a careful ledger actually shows when you read both columns without flinching. The rhyme has 40 whacks and 41. The ledger has 3 omissions, 1 verdict, 68 minutes, and a barn that held. Both of those things are true. Only one of them is honest. There was someone else in that house. Not a ghost, not a theory. A real person with a name who was present inside 92 2nd Street on the morning of August 4th, 1892, and who was alive when both Andrew and Abby Borden were killed, and who, depending on which historian you ask, has never been fully and satisfactorily eliminated from the question of what happened there. Her name was Bridget Sullivan, and the Borden family did not use it. They called her Maggie. Not because Bridget had told them to, not because she had introduced herself that way or expressed any preference for it. They called her Maggie because that was what they had called the previous servant, and changing the name when the servant changed apparently required more effort than they were prepared to make. So Bridget Sullivan, a 26-year-old Irish immigrant who had crossed an ocean and was working in Fall River to build a life, answered every morning to a name that was not hers, inside a house that did not consider her quite worth the courtesy of getting her name right. This is not a small detail. In a case where domestic tension, property disputes, and the precise social topography of who mattered and who did not have been documented as background to two murders. This detail is a map. Bridget Sullivan had been working in the Borden household for roughly 3 years by August of 1892. She had observed the family at close range for longer than most people are comfortable being observed. She knew the rhythms of that house, who came and went, what was eaten, what was argued about, where the tension lived, which rooms people avoided when other people were in them. On the morning of the murders, she had spent part of the early hours outside washing the first-floor windows from the exterior, a task that, according to her own account, had been assigned to her that morning. She had heard a sound when Andrew Borden had trouble opening the front door lock, a moment she testified to, noting that she heard Lizzie Borden laugh from somewhere on the interior staircase at the sound of the struggle with the lock. That laughter has never been explained, not definitively, not to anyone's satisfaction. Then Bridget went upstairs to rest in her attic room. And while she rested, in the 90 minutes between Abby Borden's death and Andrew Borden's, the house was quieter than usual. Police investigators, in the initial hours and days after the murders, did look at Bridget Sullivan. They looked at her the way 1892 Fall River looked at Irish immigrant women, as a category first and a person second. Her Irish heritage in the social world of that city in that decade was itself a reason to pay attention to her. But she had no documented motive. She had no known financial stake in the Borden estate. She had given a consistent account of her own whereabouts, and she cooperated with investigators in a way that, combined with the absence of a clear motive, shifted the investigative focus away from her and toward Lizzie. She left Fall River not long after the trial and eventually settled in Anaconda, Montana, where she married John Sullivan in 1905. She lived out her days in Butte, Montana, dying in March 1948 at age 79. She never gave interviews and took everything she knew to her grave. She took everything she knew with her. And what Bridget Sullivan knew about the internal life of that household, the things you absorb when you have lived inside a family for 3 years, answered to the wrong name, and watched everything from the position of someone who is present, but not quite seen, that went to Ireland and did not come back. The case has never found another Bridget Sullivan. Nobody who was inside that house on August 4th, 1892, and survived it, ever gave a full and unreserved account of everything they saw and heard. Lizzie gave 3 days of shifting testimony that was ruled inadmissible. Bridget gave consistent, narrow, carefully bounded testimony and then left the country. And the two of them together were the only living witnesses to the hours between the locked front door and the discovery of Andrew Borden's body on the sofa. 2 people knew the texture of that morning from the inside. One of them was on trial. The other one had already left Fall River for a new life out west. There is one more person this case has never fully settled accounts with. John Vinicum Morse was Andrew Borden's brother-in-law, the brother of Andrew's first wife, Sarah, who had died when Lizzie was an infant. He had arrived at 92 2nd Street the day before the murders, staying in the upstairs guest room that would later be found to contain Abby Borden's body. On the morning of August 4th, John Morse left the house early. He went to visit other relatives across town. He came back after the bodies were discovered. Here is the thing about John Morse that tends to get overlooked in the standard telling of this case. When he returned to the house and found it surrounded by police and neighbors and the full chaos of a double murder investigation, his first documented action, before he went inside, before he spoke to investigators, before he did anything that a person returning to a scene of family catastrophe would typically do, was to walk to the pear tree in the side yard and eat a pear. He stood at the pear tree. He ate the pear. Then he went inside. Investigators noted this. Newspapers noted this. And then, because John Morse produced an alibi, multiple witnesses who confirmed he had been across town during the relevant window, visiting relatives at a specific address, the pear tree moment was filed under strange behavior rather than suspicious behavior, and the investigation moved on. His alibi held. His alibi held specifically because he had been visiting people at a documented address who were willing to confirm the timeline. Nothing in the record contradicts that alibi in a prosecutable way. But here is what the record also shows. John Morse had a financial relationship with Andrew Borden that the Borden daughters found threatening. In the period before the murders, Andrew had taken steps to alter his will and make new property arrangements. Steps that the daughters, particularly Emma, interpreted as favoring Abby's side of the family over them. John Morse was connected to that financial realignment. He had been present in the house in the days when that tension was running hot enough for Emma to have recently left for Fairhaven, specifically to create distance from it, and for Lizzie to have been in active conflict with Abby over the property question. He arrived the night before both of them were killed. He left early the next morning. He came back after. He ate a pear. None of that is evidence of guilt. All of it is documented, and the combination of it, the timing of the visit, the financial context, the alibi that was thorough enough to close the door before anyone pushed it very hard. The pear tree composure in the face of a crime scene has kept John Morse on the perimeter of this case for 130 years without ever quite landing him at the center of it. Historians who have examined the case carefully have generally concluded that his alibi was genuine and that he was not involved. That is the scholarly consensus. I am not here to challenge it, but I am here to note that the investigation of John Morse occupied far fewer hours than the investigation of Lizzie Borden, that the question of his potential motive was examined less thoroughly than hers, that the alibi he provided was verified and then the door was closed, while the case against Lizzie was built across 9 months of inquest, grand jury proceedings, and trial preparation. He was a man. He was not a Borden by blood. He did not live in that house. Under the investigative logic of 1892 Fall River, those 3 facts placed him at the edge of suspicion and kept him there rather than moving him toward its center. The women inside the house were always going to absorb more scrutiny than the man who had come to visit. That is not an accusation. That is a description of how investigations worked in 1892, and how the shape of suspicion was determined by social category long before it was determined by evidence. The murder weapon in this case was found in the basement of 92 2nd Street, or rather, what investigators believed was the murder weapon was found in the basement. And the reason that sentence requires the qualification is that the weapon's condition, when it was found, was one of the most disturbing details in the entire evidentiary record, and one of the least discussed in the popular telling. The hatchet head, found without its handle, was covered in ash and dust when police located it. This would not by itself be strange. Old tools accumulate dust. Basements collect ash. Except this particular coating of ash and dust had a quality that investigators noted and that forensic examination confirmed, It appeared to have been applied, not accumulated. Applied, as though the coating had been placed on the surface deliberately, after the fact, specifically to give the impression of an object that had been sitting undisturbed for a long period of time. The handle was missing. An axe head with no handle, coated in what appeared to be strategically placed dust, found in the basement of the house where two people had just been killed with a bladed instrument. That is the weapon the prosecution brought to trial. And here is the forensic detail that makes it worse. In 1892, fingerprint evidence was a new science. Investigators at the Borden house had the opportunity, the documented, acknowledged opportunity, to attempt to lift fingerprint evidence from the hatchet. They did not execute it correctly. The process was mishandled. No usable prints were recovered. So the prosecution went to trial with a weapon that appeared to have been deliberately disguised, without its handle, without any prints to connect it to anyone's hand. The defense argued it was not the murder weapon at all. The jury was left holding an ash-coated hatchet head with no prints, no handle, and no chain of custody clean enough to settle the question of what it had last been used for. That is not a rhetorical observation. That is what the evidence table held. Now let me tell you about the blood, or rather, let me tell you about the absence of it. Abby Borden was struck approximately 19 times. Andrew was struck 10 to 11 times. These are not superficial wounds. A crime scene with that level of impact produces an arterial blood spray pattern that is extensive, directional, and almost impossible to fully contain or conceal on a human body present during the attack. A neighbor named Adelaide Churchill arrived at the Borden house within minutes of Andrew's body being discovered. She saw Lizzie. She saw no significant blood on Lizzie's clothing or person. 2 days after the murders, a police search of the house produced no blood-saturated clothing connected to Lizzie. The only blood evidence linked to Lizzie Borden was a single small spot on an underskirt. This has always been the hardest question in the case. Not for the defense, for everyone. Because if Lizzie Borden committed both murders, the near total absence of blood on her person either means she cleaned herself with extraordinary thoroughness before anyone saw her, or she found a way to commit 19 strikes on one victim and 10 on another without accumulating the blood evidence that physics and medicine say should have been present. Neither of those explanations is impossible. Neither is fully satisfying. Some investigators and historians have pointed to the pail in the basement. When police searched the house, they found a pail containing cloths stained with what appeared to be blood. Lizzie, when asked about it, said she was menstruating, a fact her family physician confirmed was consistent with the timing. The investigators, facing a piece of evidence that fell squarely into the category of female bodily functions that 1892 male investigators were deeply reluctant to engage with, took her at her word. They moved on without examining the pail's contents. The housekeeper, Bridget Sullivan, later noted that she had not seen that pail in the basement during the regular household cleaning she had done earlier in the week. It had not been there before. It was there after. Nobody examined it. The forensic opportunity closed in the first hours of the investigation, in the specific moment when a group of male investigators decided that a pail connected to female biology was not something they were going to look at closely, and moved on. If the pail contained only what Lizzie said it did, then the investigation missed nothing consequential. If the pail contained something else, rags used in a cleanup, evidence of exactly the blood that was missing from the crime scene, Then one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the entire case was left sitting in a basement while investigators stepped politely around it. We will never know. The pail was not preserved, its contents were not tested, and the specific social discomfort that caused investigators to accept the explanation without verification was itself a product of the same gender architecture that shaped every other decision made in this case from August 4th onward. The barn held. The ledger never received that entry. People have been trying to solve this case since before the trial ended. Books, documentaries, academic papers, amateur investigators, professional historians, forensic analysts applying modern methods to 130-year-old records. The Borden case has generated more retrospective investigation than almost any unsolved American crime of the 19th century, and here is the honest accounting of what all of that investigation has produced. It has not produced a conviction. It has not produced a confession. It has not produced a piece of evidence so definitive that the community of serious historians who study this case has reached a consensus position on guilt or innocence. What it has produced is a cleaner understanding of what was possible and what was not, and a set of competing interpretations that serious scholars hold with genuine disagreement. The strongest case for Lizzie's guilt rests on the convergence of circumstantial elements: the proximity, the timing, the shifted inquest testimony, the burned dress, the poison attempt, the disputed loft and its contested dust. Individually insufficient, collectively suggestive of a pattern that is hard to explain away completely. The strongest case for reasonable doubt rests on exactly what the defense said in 1893. The prosecution could not definitively place the weapon in her hand, could not account for the blood evidence, or rather the absence of it, could not explain how a woman in the clothing documented on that morning committed 2 violent attacks without producing a single witness who saw blood on her, and could not put before the jury the witnesses and documents that might have resolved these questions. Because those witnesses and documents had been excluded. Both arguments live in the same case file, and then there are the alternative suspects, the ones the case keeps generating, because human beings are uncomfortable with permanent ambiguity and keep searching for a cleaner answer. William Borden, an illegitimate son of Andrews, has been proposed by some investigators. The theory has supporters, but lacks documentary evidence strong enough to sustain serious historical scrutiny. Andrews' business enemies, and he had documented enemies, men who had felt the full weight of his particular brand of accumulation across decades of financial maneuvering in Fall River, have been examined. None of them have produced evidence that places them inside that house on August 4th. The theories keep coming because the case keeps refusing to close. And the reason it keeps refusing to close is the same reason it has always refused to close. Because the evidentiary record was damaged in the first 72 hours and damaged deliberately, and what was left after the damage was done was insufficient to produce certainty in either direction. The poison was excluded. The testimony was sealed. The dress was ash. The hatchet was dusted. The pail was not examined. And a woman with an account of her own movements that shifted over 3 days of inquest testimony was acquitted in 68 minutes by 12 men who had been given a carefully curated version of the available evidence. What you are left with is not a mystery in the entertainment sense, the kind with a solution waiting in a sealed envelope. You are left with something more uncomfortable than that. You are left with a case in which the machinery of justice produced a verdict, and the machinery of evidence management produced a ledger with entries missing. And those two things are not the same as truth, and cannot be made to act like truth, no matter how many books are written about them. Let me tell you what this case is actually about. Not what it says it's about, not hatchets and alibis and courtroom procedure. What it is actually about, underneath all of that, in the place where the story keeps pulling people back after 130 years. It is about a house. Not the house at 92 2nd Street specifically, though that house is real and it still stands, and you can book a room in it tonight if the dates are open. It is about what a house means when the people inside it are connected by blood and money and obligation and mutual interest, but not by warmth. When the roof covers a financial arrangement as much as a family. When the person who controls the estate has deliberately, provably, stubbornly kept the people who depend on him in a condition that is comfortable enough not to be cruel, but constrained enough to make the dependency impossible to forget. Andrew Borden was not a warm man. This is not speculation or retrospective character assassination. The historical record, the accounts from contemporaries, the documented property disputes, the testimony of people who knew him, the simple fact that his daughters found his house embarrassing enough to be publicly humiliated by it and were still living in it in their 30s because the alternative was losing the financial connection. The record does not describe warmth. It describes a man who was very good at accumulation and very uncomfortable with redistribution, including in the direction of his own children. The property arrangements he was beginning to make in the months before his death, the arrangements that favored Abby, that moved assets toward her family, that worried both daughters enough to create documented household tension. Those arrangements were the specific financial context inside which two people died. And Lizzie Borden, the woman who went to trial and was acquitted and moved to Maplecroft and carved her new name in stone and stayed in Fall River until she died, Lizzie inherited. After everything that happened, after the trial and the acquittal and the social exile and the carving and the name change and the 34 years of being frozen out by the city she refused to leave, she inherited the estate. She lived on Andrew Borden's money for the rest of her life. She stayed in the house she bought with it. She carved the name in the step. And when she died in 1927 at 66 years old, she left more than $50,000 to the Animal Rescue League of Fall River. Not to Emma. Emma had already died 11 days before, in a boarding house where she had spent 22 years rather than return to the house on the hill. Not to Bridget Sullivan in Montana, who had once answered to the wrong name and had taken everything she knew with her when she left. Not to any of the charitable organizations her father had pointedly supported during his lifetime. To the animals. There is a specific kind of human decision that can only be read as a statement. A will is a ledger, too. Final column, last entry, the last time the numbers are arranged before the book is closed for good. Lizzie Borden's final ledger says, "Here is what I trust. Here is what I consider worth sustaining after I am gone. Here is the direction in which I choose to point whatever remains." She pointed it away from people, away from the city, away from the institutions of respectability that had tried her and acquitted her and then refused to take her back, toward something that had never asked her any questions and had never needed her to explain herself. Whether that reads as guilt or grief or loneliness or the simple preferences of an elderly woman with money and no family left. That is something only Lizzie could have told you. She didn't. She kept the silence Emma kept. She kept the silence Bridget kept. She kept the silence the Pale kept, sitting in that basement while investigators stepped around it and moved on. The full barn protected her. The ledger kept its missing entries, and the doors that were locked before the jury arrived stayed exactly where Robinson left them. Locked, still, permanently. But here is the thing I have been building toward since the first time I mentioned the ledger. The ledger has one more entry, not a dramatic one, not a confession or a deathbed revelation or a letter found in a wall. This is not that kind of story, and the people who have looked for that kind of ending have been looking for 130 years without finding it. The last entry is simpler than that, and heavier. It is the question of what she knew, not what she did, what she knew. It is the thing that everyone who has ever studied this case in depth eventually arrives at. The question that sits underneath every other question, quieter than the hatchet and more durable than the ash. It is the question of what she knew, not what she did, what she knew. Because there is a version of this case, documented, sourced, argued by serious historians, in which Lizzie Borden knew exactly what was going to happen in that house and made a specific choice about what to do with that knowledge. And that version changes everything. Chapter 7. She walked out of that New Bedford courtroom on June 20th, 1893, and the crowd outside cheered for her. Not politely, not with the restrained approval of a civic audience watching due process reach its conclusion. They cheered the way people cheer for a story that ends the way they needed it to end. The kind of cheering that has almost nothing to do with the specific woman standing in front of them, and everything to do with what her acquittal meant to everyone who had decided, before the trial even opened, what kind of woman she was. Lizzie Borden heard that crowd. She stepped into it. She received it. And then she went home and started spending her father's money. Not recklessly, not dramatically, with the quiet, deliberate precision of someone who had been waiting a very long time to be on the right side of a locked door. She purchased a large, handsome house on French Street, the Hill District of Fall River, the neighborhood her father had refused to live in despite having more than enough money to do so, the neighborhood where the respectable families of Fall River actually resided. She named it Maplecroft. And then she did something that has always struck historians who study this case as a detail that carries more weight than it appears to. She had the name carved directly into the front step of the house, not on a plaque, not on a gate, into the stone itself, underfoot, where every person who entered the house would step across it, where it could not be removed without damaging the structure, where it announced itself not as decoration, but as permanence. Maplecroft. This is mine. I am not leaving. Andrew Borden had kept his daughters in a house without running water upstairs, in a neighborhood where they were quietly embarrassed to receive guests, in a condition of financial dependence so complete that both women were still living in that house in their 30s. Not because they lacked money. Their father had roughly $300,000, the equivalent of approximately $10 million today. Not because there was no alternative, because he chose not to provide it. The first thing Lizzie did with her inheritance was buy exactly what he had withheld. That is not a small thing. That is a statement made in stone and carved underfoot, where nobody can miss it. And here is what the ledger shows when you open it to the final entries. She had the house. She had the money. She had the name carved in the step. She was acquitted, free, and financially secure for the first time in her adult life. She was also completely, permanently, irreversibly alone in that city. Fall River society, which had circled the edges of this case with a combination of fascination and horror since August 4th, 1892, did not come back to her after the verdict. The churches that had supported her during the trial, the women's groups, the charitable circles, the respectable social architecture of a New England mill city that had briefly decided to believe in her, closed quietly, the way doors close in well-furnished houses, not slammed, not bolted, simply shut with the kind of finality that is more total than any lock because there is no key to look for. She had been acquitted of murder. She was not forgiven for being suspected of it. Those are two different things. Fall River understood the difference perfectly. Emma Borden came home after the murders. She moved into Maplecroft with Lizzie after the acquittal. She lived there for 12 years. In 1905, Emma left. She packed her things and left Maplecroft for good. She gave no public explanation. She did not hold a press conference, write a letter for publication, or grant a single interview to the reporters who approached her wanting to know why. She simply left, and she never spoke to Lizzie again. For 22 years, from 1905 until both women died within days of each other in June 1927, Emma Borden and Lizzie Borden lived in the same city, Fall River, Massachusetts, and did not speak. 22 years. Historians have spent decades trying to identify the specific trigger for Emma's departure. Several theories have circulated. Some center on Lizzie's friendship with the actress Nance O'Neill, a relationship that had generated local gossip and that Emma reportedly found deeply uncomfortable. Some center on a more generalized estrangement, the slow accumulation of years of living inside the most scrutinized household in Fall River, with a woman the city had decided to freeze out. What no serious historian has been able to produce is evidence that Emma left because she knew something specific about what happened on August 4th, 1892. That conclusion, the one the internet loves, the one every true crime retelling of this story reaches for, is not in the record. It is an inference drawn from the silence, and silence is not evidence. Silence is just silence. But here's what the record does show. Emma Borden was the one person alive in 1905 who had grown up in that house, who had watched her father manage his estate the way a man manages property rather than people, who had felt the specific texture of the financial arrangement that kept both daughters dependent and resentful and unable to leave, who had returned home after the murders to find her sister acquitted and her father's money now available to purchase exactly the house he had always refused to provide. Emma had lived inside every layer of this story from the beginning. She had been there for the property transfer arguments. She had been there during the household illness in late July of 1892. She had left for Fairhaven before the murders and had that absence become part of the case's geography. The detail that places her 40 miles away on the morning of August 4th, present nowhere in the timeline, a ghost in her own family's catastrophe. She came back. She stayed 12 years. She left. And whatever she was carrying when she left, whatever accumulated knowledge, whatever private interpretation of 12 years of shared life inside Maplecroft, whatever understanding she had arrived at about her sister and about that August morning, she took it with her to Newmarket, New Hampshire, and kept it until she died. Lizzie died June 1st, 1927. Emma died June 10th, 9 days later. They did not see each other. They did not reconcile. They died 9 days apart in different houses without speaking. The ledger closes that way, not with resolution. With two women dying within 2 weeks of each other, one of them in the house she carved her name into, the other in Newmarket, New Hampshire, where she had chosen to be alone rather than return. At the end of Chapter 6, I told you there was a version of this case, documented, argued by serious historians, in which Lizzie Borden knew exactly what was going to happen in that house. Not necessarily the version where she picked up the hatchet herself, a different version, the version where the question isn't what she did, but what she knew, and what she chose to do with that knowledge. Let me walk you through it carefully, because this is the territory where it is easiest to slide from history into speculation, and I am not going to do that. Every step here is sourced. Every claim is attributed. The uncertainty is real and documented, not manufactured for drama. The household had been sick. In the last days of July and the first days of August 1892, everyone in that house experienced severe gastric distress, vomiting, nausea, the particular misery of an illness that arrives suddenly and lingers. Andrew was sick. Abby was sick enough to walk to the family physician, Dr. Seabury Bowen, and tell him she believed the household had been poisoned. Bridget Sullivan reported feeling unwell. Lizzie reported feeling unwell. Abby told Dr. Bowen she feared poisoning. Dr. Bowen dismissed it. He attributed the illness to bad food, specifically to mutton and Johnny cakes that had been sitting out in summer heat and reserved across multiple meals. The kind of frugal household management that Andrew Borden's insistence on careful economy produced. The illness resolved. The household recovered. And then, on August 3rd, 1892, one day before the murders, Lizzie Borden walked to D.R. Smith's drugstore on the corner of Main and Columbia Streets, approached the counter, and asked the drugstore clerk, Eli Bentz, to sell her prussic acid. Prussic acid is hydrogen cyanide. She said she wanted it to clean a sealskin cape, a stated use that was plausible enough since diluted prussic acid had legitimate household applications in Victorian fur care. Eli Bentz refused. He told her he could not sell prussic acid without a doctor's prescription. She reportedly told him she had purchased it there before. He held firm and sent her away. She went home. The next morning, both Andrew and Abby Borden were killed with a bladed instrument. And here is the version that serious historians have examined without fully resolving. The household had recently suffered what may have been a poisoning attempt. Or may not. The evidence is genuinely disputed, and Dr. Bowen's alternative explanation is medically plausible. The day before the murders, the primary suspect attempted to purchase a substance that kills human beings. She was refused. And the following morning, the two people she had reason to want removed from her financial future were dead. The question is not whether she poisoned anyone. She didn't. The method of death was definitively blunt force. The question historians have sat with is this: what does the attempted prussic acid purchase mean in the context of a household that had just been sick with something that felt like poisoning? One interpretation: nothing connected. The fur cape explanation was genuine. The timing was coincidental. The illness was bad mutton. The murders happened through a completely separate chain of events. Another interpretation: someone in that house had already been thinking about this, had already been planning something, had one method refused at the drugstore counter and used another the following morning. Historians do not agree on this. The outline for this documentary is explicit. These are the possible interpretations, not established conclusions. What is established, what is not disputed, is that the jury never heard Eli Bentz. They never heard what she asked for at that counter. They never heard the word prussic acid in connection with her name. They never had the opportunity to place the purchase attempt one day before the murders into the same frame as the hatchet found in the basement and the dress that became ash. They decided on the version of the story that remained after those things were removed. And now I need you to think about what that means, not what it proves. It doesn't prove anything. Courts make evidentiary decisions for documented legal reasons, and the reasons the judges gave for excluding Eli Bentz's testimony are real. The causal link between an attempted acid purchase and a blunt force murder is genuinely tenuous in a legal sense. But this documentary has never been about what a courtroom can prove. It has been about the gap between what was heard and what existed. And the gap in this case, the specific, documented, deliberately constructed gap between what the jury was given and what the record contains, is wide enough to drive the entire unanswered history of this case through it. I want to go back to something I planted at the very beginning of this documentary. Before the trial opened in that new Bedford courtroom in June of 1893, I told you there were doors into this case that had been sealed. I told you this documentary was going to open them. That was the promise. Now we're at the end of the building, and the doors are standing right here. Let's look at what was behind them. The first door, Eli Bentz. He was prepared to walk into that courtroom and tell 12 men under oath that on the afternoon of August 3rd, 1892, the day before Andrew and Abby Borden were killed, a woman named Lizzie Borden had stood at his counter and asked him to sell her something that kills human beings. He had refused her. He would have said so in front of the jury. On June 15th, 1893, the three-judge panel ruled his testimony inadmissible. The legal reasoning was that the acid was not used in the murders, and the connection was therefore too speculative to be placed before a jury. Eli Bentz went home. The jury never heard his name. That door was closed before they walked in. The second door, the inquest transcript. For 3 days in August 1892, Lizzie Borden sat before a judge and answered questions about her movements on the morning of August 4th. She gave accounts that shifted. Her story about the barn, about where she had been during the 90 minutes when Abby was killed upstairs, changed between sessions. The contradictions were documented and preserved in a transcript that prosecutors carried to trial, believing it would be central to their case. On June 12, 1893, the judges ruled it inadmissible. The legal ground was that Lizzie had testified without being formally warned of her right to silence, and the testimony was therefore obtained under conditions that compromised its use. The transcript went into a file. The contradictions went with it. The jury heard none of the 3 different versions of where she was during those 90 minutes. That door was sealed. The third door, the dress. This one is the most unsettling because this door was not closed by a judge's ruling. It was closed in a kitchen on a Sunday morning, 3 days after 2 people died. Alice Russell watched Lizzie Borden stand at the kitchen stove and feed a light blue bengaline dress into the fire. She heard Lizzie say it was stained with paint. No witness confirmed paint stains. No paint was verified. The dress burned down to nothing, and what it might have shown, what a forensic examination of the fabric might have told investigators about where she was and what she was near on the morning of August 4th, became ash. Alice Russell did testify about this at trial. The jury heard that the dress had been burned. That is the important distinction. The jury knew a dress had been destroyed. They just could not hold it, examine it, or ask what had actually been on it. Because it was ash. 3 doors, a drugstore clerk, a sealed transcript, a pile of ash in a kitchen stove. The jury deliberated for 68 minutes. The rhyme appeared after all of this. It appeared after the trial and the verdict and the cheering crowd and the carved stone step and Emma packing her bags in 1905. It appeared after everything real had already happened, after the actual architecture of this case, the sealed doors, the excluded testimonies, the burned fabric, the conflicting accounts, had been replaced in the public imagination by something that fit on a playground. Lizzie Borden took an axe. 4 lines with the wrong numbers, the wrong relationship, and the wrong emotional register for what actually happened in that house. The rhyme made the whole thing simple. It made it funny, almost. Dark funny, vaudeville funny, the way things become funny when they are packaged at the right distance from their actual horror. It gave generations of Americans something to recite that made them feel like they knew the story, when what they actually had was a compressed, inaccurate punchline, standing where a real and genuinely unresolved question used to be. What the rhyme cost is not just accuracy. Accuracy is the easy part to grieve. What it cost is the question, because when you know the rhyme, you feel like the case is closed. Lizzie did it or Lizzie didn't, and either way the counting song is there to give it a shape and a beat and a tidy ending. When you know only the rhyme, you do not ask what Eli Bence would have said on that stand. You do not ask why the inquest transcript was sealed. You do not sit with the specific, uncomfortable fact that the lead defense attorney had appointed one of the presiding judges, and that same attorney stood before a jury and asked them to trust their assumptions about what kind of woman could do this, and that the jury took 68 minutes to confirm that their assumptions were correct. You do not ask any of that. You just count to 40 and 41 and go to recess. That is what a good rhyme does. It makes you feel like you've arrived somewhere when what it's actually done is close a door. I told you at the beginning of this documentary that a ledger is a document with columns, assets and liabilities, what is present and what is missing, what was paid and what was owed. The Borden case has a ledger. On one side, a not guilty verdict, delivered in 68 minutes by 12 men who were given a carefully shaped version of the available evidence, in a courtroom where the most powerful attorney was defending the woman he was also connected to through judicial appointment, in a culture that had already decided what kind of woman was capable of what kind of act. On the other side, a drugstore clerk who went home. A 3-day inquest transcript sitting in a sealed file. A dress that was ash before anyone could examine it. A pail in a basement that investigators declined to look at closely. A shifting account of 90 minutes that the jury was never permitted to hear. The barn was always the symbol, not a literal barn. The barn in this story is something else. It is the safety net, the structure that stands behind a person when everything else goes wrong. It is the place you retreat to when you need to explain where you were during the 90 minutes that matter most. Lizzie said she was in the barn loft looking for fishing sinkers. Officers who examined that loft found no disturbed dust, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. The barn offered no protection. It gave back nothing. And the ledger, the actual account of what this case was, what evidence it held, and what was removed from it, that ledger has never been fully balanced. It cannot be. Too many entries are missing. Too many pages were removed or burned or sealed by judicial ruling before the final column was ever totaled. Lizzie Borden's story has its own compression. The rhyme is 4 lines, wrong numbers, the stepmother made into a mother, the violence made into a schoolyard rhythm. And underneath it, in the record that the rhyme replaced, the real ledger sits. It has 3 columns where the entries are missing, one for a drugstore clerk, one for an inquest transcript, one for a dress. The jury never opened those columns. Nobody has opened them officially since. The verdict was not guilty. The ledger was never closed.